Hello, students. It's good to see you, even though I can't really see you. Um, so this is sort of the big finish of the Republic, and I think that it's a lot to walk through. I'm going to try to hit the highlights in a way that will help you with your introspection. But if you have follow-up questions, go ahead and tell me. So we've come to this place where we established the city, right? And we established the fact that the city and the soul are the same, on the same track, right? When you say one is true of the other. We established what the four virtues are that exist in relation to the city and the soul. And we importantly established that we are looking at the city for, quote, the sake of a pattern, the sake of a pattern. So not for exact like replica of institutions everywhere. Okay, but actually it's for the sake of a pattern. And I think based on by the time we get to the myth of that you'll see that this pattern is for the soul. So let's go ahead and get started. We've known now how knowledge is accrued, how the philosopher king can rule. And we've learned also about the oneness, the unity of being. And through these things, we see that the ordered society and the ordered soul are guided by reason, reflecting on this sort of high point of the divided line, right? And then rendering it into its appropriate places. Now, this is a story where you don't have a happy ending. And I think it's important that it doesn't from a philosophical perspective, because what you see happen is this. Even with the best capacities that humans have for knowledge of the good, we imperfectly understand it. And the world is in flux in a way that even at the highest levels of our virtues, we can only respond to. The story is a story of regime deterioration from this apex to something totally different. And it goes in steps. So I'm going to walk you through the story of the regime decline cycle. And I want to point out a few things because but before we actually get into it. The first thing is that the nature of each regime is reflective of their particular goal. So basically, the whole structure of what the polis is aiming at is what defines them, what drives them, what they're structured toward. For Aristotle, later, this would be a telos. For Augustine, later, this would be a love, right? What a desire, sort of what orients all of what you do. And it's these changes in attachment, it's these changes in what orients you that cause the changes in the regime. And remember also the human soul, because the city is the soul writ large. Now, it's also the case that in each part of the story of the deterioration of the regime, there is some account of the private life, of the life in the home, or the interactions between citizens. And I think that's important because so far, a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of like human interaction is maybe on the more abstract level, but this is maybe more relatable and more like what the normal human experience involves. And there are probably moments in history you can point to that reflect times like these. So that's what I wanted to say before we keep going. The 5 regimes are aristocracy or monarchy, but it's the rule of the best. Democracy, that's honor-loving rule. Oligarchy, that's money or acquisition, love of money acquisition. Democracy, the love of democracy is complex, and so is the love of tyranny. So we'll wait till we get there to describe those things. So what aristocracy and monarchy seek or love in a way that conditions its opinions and its motivations is the good and the just. And the private citizen there loves the good and the just. The rest of Book 8 and Book 9 is the story of cyclic decline and of community decline. So we're starting at the top, right? Why does it decline? Okay, well, specifically, it declines because the rulers make a mistake. Remember how they have a lottery to help people mate, right? In the right way that will produce the right kind of citizens for what they're looking for? They get the number wrong. The nuptial number is what it's called. And so they make the wrong matches. So even with all of their knowledge and all their capacity, they are not able to come to a true conclusion. And the result of this is that the quality of the people, the next generation of rulers, declines. So what does this point to? You know, by now we've established that this is about looking for the sake of a pattern and not literally building a city exactly this way. So he's not literally planning on eugenics. What this points to, and this is one of the things I told you when we're studying Plato, we need to ask what the further point behind something is the inevitability of error on Earth, even at our highest human capacities. And while we have the ability to, or some of us do, very few of us do, according to Plato, to understand the eternal and unchanging, life on Earth is not eternal and unchanging. It's imperfect and it's decaying. And this also raises the possibility that even the best soul will fail, even the best regime will fail, that this is just part of being humans. The first change that you see in the decline of aristocracy towards democracy is a change in the education system. And that's because the less perfect rulers that are a result of this mistake, they don't know how to order the education of the city such that it's able to maintain its connection to the true, to the just. And this part's really interesting. With the loss of that shared process of knowledge, factions form in the city itself based on the divergent loves of what different people think is good. what different people think government should be oriented toward, that their lives should be oriented toward. And so you're splitting up into these different, basically, groups that are now going to be at odds with each other. Who takes over next? The auxiliaries, okay, the soldiers. And you can kind of see why. I mean, I think implicitly, one of the reasons is because you would have, they would have the most institutional strength, like on this account, and also the most capacity for violence, okay? But they love victory and they love honor, okay? So in the individual soul, what this change would look like would be moving from reason taking over to the victory loving, honor loving parts of us taking over. And that's thumos, that's spiritedness. And the danger here is that you want to win, you want honor and victory more than you want to get those things for a good reason. And it also means that if doing the just thing means that you won't get honor or victory, you're not going to do it. This is an unjust city now and an unjust soul now, but it's not the lowest point. The wisdom loving part is out, right? And there's an impact on moderation, right? Because there's no agreement on who should rule. And this, I just want to throw out a quick nod here to something that's true for basically all of the ancient virtue theorists, which is that there's a unity of the virtues. When you start to lack in one, you will start to lack in another, that they are like a wheel, spokes of a wheel, or like a web that rely on each other. The outcome isn't as bad as it could be, you know, so there's still courage as a virtue. And the next step is going to be worse, and it's oligarchy. So because honor and victory become so important, right? They become disconnected from any metric of how to honor or how to give victory, right? In a just way. And so eventually, honor and winning become synonymous with money and wealth, because people confuse the wealth and money and fame that sometimes goes along with victory and honor for the essence of victory and honor itself, okay? And one thing that's kind of interesting, if you think about it, you know, sometimes I ask students what part of the regime cycle do they think we're in, and some will say oligarchy, and some will say democracy, and some will say tyranny. But what you see this in our culture, where if somebody has money, we think that they must have all of these other virtues too, that they must be smart, that they must be able to come up with a good plan, that they must be able to be a source of good opinions for us and of advice. You can think of any number of figures like this, right? And it's like a qualification. Whereas I don't think Plato is saying that there's anything inherently wrong with wealth, but that mistaking it for a virtue on its own is the problem, right? And you can see why this happened in this account. Now there's a wealth qualification to be enfranchised in the city, which means the poor are disenfranchised. And in an earlier part of the book, Plato has a sort of throwaway line about the city needing to have a good middle class so that it wasn't in a civil war. Okay, right? So then this is one of the implications of that. That's gone now. So remember that the Timocratic man displaced his rational part with his spirited part. Now the oligarchic man replaces the spirited part with the appetitive part. But the appetitive part of the soul, it turns out, is divided into different types of appetites. And this level of appetite is the necessary appetite, basically what's profitable for sustaining life, things that you can't desist from. So the virtue that's lost here is courage. The oligarchic man doesn't know what's to be feared. He thinks the worst thing he can do is lose money, right? And there's disdain, whereas in the earlier form of democracy, there was a simulacrum of the type of virtue that would be honored in the just regime. There's no simulacrum here. Anything that is associated with that kind of virtue account is despised and looked down on as like irrational or against your self-interest. And in terms of the family here, one thing that's interesting is that Plato talks about this being a transition that happens in large part, and I kind of hate this explanation because it's a little bit misogynistic, but this is, I'm just going to give the example. So that the father, the Timocratic father, loves honor. And he really does love honor. He may not always connect it up to justice. He may not always be able to choose justice over honor, but it is honor that he loves. It is the Demotic part that's working, right? To the point that there's not, they don't value bringing money home, bringing wealth home. So you have a son in the house who hears from his mother, your father pursues all these honors, all this public spirited stuff. And here we are, you know, we're poor. If he would do something else, or we're not poor, we don't have everything we could have. He would apply himself in another way. The things he's doing are worthless. They don't benefit us, really. And so what the son learns from watching the interactions between his mother and father is that honor won't pay the bills. Honor won't really bring you what you need. What you need is money, okay? And that's how you devolve into the oligarchic man. Now, remember, the oligarchic man has lost courage. And one of the primary ways you know this is because they're obsessed with money. And the money is something that they're going to use for necessary desires. So like a good example here is maybe this is an outdated example for your age, but like Scrooge McDuck. Scrooge McDuck makes a lot of money, right? But what do his nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie say? You know, they seem to think he doesn't want to spend it. They think he's stingy, and he is stingy. He wants to accrue money because he's afraid of losing money. But, you know, why does he want the money? He wants the money for security, for the security of the necessities in life, okay? When we get to the next regime, which is democracy, oh, excuse me, 1 second, please. So we're to this next level, the democratic level, and the oligarch fears a lot. Courage is gone, so fears multiply. Primarily what they fear, though, is loss of acquisition. And what ends up happening is they engage in these wars of acquisition. Now, they're not, there's not, they don't have any martial virtue, okay? So after engaging in battles alongside the oligarchs that are born of the oligarchs' greed, the democratic man realizes he's as capable as the oligarch. In fact, he's more capable. He's more capable on battlefields. These people don't seem to know what they're doing. They're caught up in all this bureaucracy, and they're not communicating well, and they lack courage. Okay. So this makes them realize that there is no virtue in the oligarch that makes it just for the oligarch to rule. And so one of the things about rule is legitimacy, right? The people who are being ruled have to think that their rulers legitimately rule them. And what these people at this point in the regime realize is that there's no reason these people are qualified. And there's no reason why wealth should make them able to be our rulers. They actually can't do anything. They need us to do it, and they send us to do it. And we're the ones risking our lives. Now, in the family, the son of the oligarch sees his father's life as a life spent in toil, right? Driven for the necessary desires without the joy of pleasures. Okay, without the joy of pleasures. And everybody knows, and you know from the symposium, or if you haven't read the symposium, I'm telling you in the symposium, that eros is natural to the human. And the question is where it's directed. And that eros brings joy. So the oligarch basically, his eros is for the money, right? But it's in this sort of weird way. And to the son, the life looks joyless. It looks like there's no pleasure there. And the line that Plato actually uses is out of hatred for his father's stinginess, right? Is how you get the democratic man. Now, democracy seeks freedom for its own sake. This is one of the interesting things about this kind of regime. All the other ends or loves or the telos of the other regimes are very concrete, but this is not concrete. This is going to be very open-ended. Basically, it's you can choose what you prioritize, and that is what the essence of the regime is. There's prioritization of freedom of speech, the freedom to arrange your private life as you please, no requirements for rule. So remember, the oligarchs had a wealth qualification that's gone, but any requirements are gone. And the primary thing that you would say about somebody if you were praising them is that they wish other people well. In the individual soul, we're still in the realm of the appetitive, but we move from the necessary to the unnecessary appetites. So the oligarch was into the appetites that we can't desist from, and that's sort of what his fears in his life were oriented around. But for the democratic man, this is the things that we can do without. And actually, he includes sex here, right? So Plato distrusts these kinds of pleasures, I think, even more because he thinks they don't have a natural limit, or that because they can be done without, when they become the sole driving force, you're making the sole driving force something that in reality isn't even needed. At least in the previous regime, those things were needed, even if they were low or base. You could see that a human would need them in moderation. So, which appetites rule? All of them. And actually, this is the way that we run into tyranny, is because we lose the ability to distinguish between higher and lower passions. And variety is prized, which makes this actually, he says, the most beautiful and the most colorful regime. And this is the regime, the only other regime in which philosophy is possible. All the other regimes, except for the monarchy, aristocracy, are not possible for philosophy to thrive. But here you can, right? Because you can be free to do that. But generally speaking, the virtues are redefined. And over time, freedom kind of becomes conflated with anarchy, really. And the upshot of this sort of inability to come to any shared conclusion on what should be prioritized leads to a democratic system that has no direction, and it can't prioritize one good over another with consensus, right? So it becomes chaotic, politically speaking. And they look for one strong man to save them, Plato says, one strong man, and who will basically iron out all of their differences, and just take away that choice from them, take away that burden of deciding. This is a popular leader who ends up betraying them. And the irony here is that the people who love freedom most of all are now enslaved. Okay. Here, by a tyrant. Here, Plato makes begins to make the argument that the real enslavement is being dominated by your passions. So that, and this is an argument that has recurred throughout the Republic, which is that yes, there are great injustices that can happen to us, but there's a kind of human freedom that can't be touched in the soul, right? That is ordered. That goes back to the very beginning of the Republic. For this regime, right, what you'll see is that the tyrant is really the most enslaved person of all, because they're in complete thrall to their passions. So they seem like they're totally in charge, and they seem like they're, and they are commanding people and destroying people, but they are not interiorly free. And we'll get into this more in a way that I hope makes more sense. So the tyrant still loves something. He loves power. It's a kind of misguided way of loving himself. But his love is always to the detriment of others. You'll see he kills his friends. So his real friends are going to criticize him or are going to not participate in tyrannical things that he wants them to. And they're going to say, you know, no, this isn't good for you, or no, this isn't a good thing to do. So he eliminates them. And eventually he even kills his own father. Now, this is really important. I might have mentioned it before. I think I did. And I hope it puts book 5 in an even bigger light, which is that for the ancients and the medievals, killing your own is maybe the most unnatural thing. It's a sign that there's something totally inhuman going on here, because you can have you can do lots of terrible things, and they're all really bad, but even some of the worst people will do a lot to preserve their family, because they see it, right, as the first love, and there's something kind of natural about that. So this is how unnatural the tyrant is, and how unnatural anyone who will kill father, son, mother, daughter, etc. is, brother or sister. The fact he's a parasite is part of how we know that he's so disordered. He kills the people who formed him, who made him. So now we're into this division of the appetites again. We had this is unnecessary desires being divided. Okay, so we have the necessary desires. Then we talked about the unnecessary desires that bring pleasure, right? That characterize the democracy. Okay, now he's going to split the unnecessary desires into two categories: the lawful and the lawless, or the loathsome. And the lawless appetites are the dark side of human nature, basically the desire to dominate. With the democratic man is always pursuing desire. He lacks moderation. But what you see in full bloom in the tyrant is that the best part of the soul, which is reason, is completely under the control of these lawless appetites, this desire for domination. The tyrant has no friends, just flatterers, or they kill their real friends. So the only people who are going to be their friends are going to be people who are lying to them, who see them as a means to an end. And that's how he sees them too. I mean, you see this in like these people aren't tyrants, but I'm just saying, you see this in the life of like Elvis or Demi Lovato, that when they're struggling with addiction, sometimes the people that surround them, in the end, the ones that stick around, are the ones who don't care if good things happen to them, who want to get money and fame out of the relationship, and who don't really care if they're addicted and on a bad path, okay? And the truer friends are left behind. Now, Plato says his waking life is like a nightmare. So he's unsatisfied, he's unsatisfiable, he's paranoid, he's lonely, he's willing to do anything to satisfy himself. It's like a compulsion or an addiction. Maybe might be one way of thinking about it, as an analogy. And he's driven by these appetites. Now, I want to explain a little bit about the life of being a waking nightmare. So I always think this illustrates this point well, and it is kind of gruesome, but there's a murder that happened, I think, in the Midwest, probably about 20 years ago now. And it happened because these two men needed money and they were in this grocery store and they saw a woman and her daughter, and they thought that they were both attractive. So they followed them home and they invaded the house. And long story short, you know, they separated the father from them. I think the father's the only one who survived. They got the mother to give them money, actually to give them what was in their bank account, and then they tied there were 3 women, 1 mother and 2 daughters. They tied them all to the beds and they assaulted them. Then they burned the house down, which meant that these people were burned alive. So why am I telling you this terrible thing? I'm telling you because when one of the men who did this, they were both eligible for the death penalty. One of the men who did this eventually asked his lawyer to stop trying to evade the death penalty and to let him be killed by the state. Because he said, whether I'm asleep or whether I'm awake, all I remember is what I did and what I saw and what I heard. And I can't live this way anymore. It's better that I'm dead. This is the level that the tyrant is at. That's why I went through this whole illustration. This level of dominating, of depravity, of just completely consuming other people at your whim, is the level of the tyrant. And what that does to the human person is either, on Plato's account, it can't be lived with. It can't be born out over time. That cracks start to show, right, in the person. So who's the most wretched of men in the end, right? Remember, the whole point of all of this is to prove that justice is pleasurable and worth, and it's efficacious, right? So it's beneficial and it's pleasurable, and it's better to be just than to be unjust. Well, who's the most wretched of men? It's a tyrant. He's not free. He can technically do anything he wants, but freedom is the freedom to face reality on this account. He's not really wealthy because he's always wanting something new. He's not secure because he's always afraid that somebody's going to kill him or get him because he's done so many things that people should revenge. He's not self-sufficient because he can never take care of his own desires, and they're what's in the driver's seat for him. He is basically totally out of control of himself. The regime deterioration of comparing the just man to the unjust man is complete now. Okay? And you see the whole purpose for the city soul analogy. In the end, the tyrant is destroyed. So he offers, I'm going to go through this really quickly, three proofs against Thrasymachus. And this is something he says very well that I've been trying to say and I have not said well, but it's a kind of takeaway. Therefore, it is pleasant to become full of what is by nature suitable. That which is more really full of things that are more would cause one to enjoy true pleasure more really and truly, while what partakes in things that are less would be less truly and surely full, and would partake in a pleasure less trustworthy and less true. And here the divided line should be in your mind. Here the discussion of shaping taste through education should be in mind. Like an example would be if I eat food that is really a lot of carbs at one time, and it's so delicious, right? But then, like in 2 hours, I'm hungry again. But I just ate all of this food. Okay, so the analogy here, and it would be on this account, it would be simple carbs, not complex carbs, but um, the analogy here is that what is good, when you fill yourself with what is good, what is suited to your nature, you're more fully in reality and you're more fully satisfied. And what partakes in things that are less will fill you less. And so you will be restless constantly, and you will be always searching, always seeking, and unable to really fulfill yourself. Um, so the three proofs against Thrasymachus in the end are the tyrant, the city soul, and regime deterioration story. The way that philosophy helps us to know the true nature of pleasure and pain and lets us decide between them. We have the right capacity for taste. And then the last one is the many-headed beast, the story of the Hydra, the lion, and the man. This idea that in all of us, there's a man, there's a lion, there's a Hydra. The Hydra is the appetites, the lion is the thumas, and the man is the reason. And which one you feed more is the one that has control of the body. And so you want to fill yourself with what feeds the man more. And the interesting thing about the Hydra being desire is that it is endless. When you cut off the head of a Hydra, two more spring up in its place, right? So it's not, and again, in the symposium we see desire is not bad, and you can see in the Republic that desire is not bad. The question is, what should we desire? And what we should desire has a lot to do with the unity of the soul. So in book 10, the biggest upshot, I think, is that I want you to walk away with is sort of this complicating moment. So this is the myth. Remember that he said they're looking for a blueprint in heaven, and a pattern, right? So one question that keeps coming up over and over again in the Republic, and it comes up for Aristotle too, is whether or not it's possible to have a soul that is different than your regime. Like, basically, if you're in a bad regime, are you just doomed to having this fate? And he says, yes, it is possible to have a soul that is different than your regime if you have what he calls a blueprint in heaven. The myth of is a reincarnation myth, and I wanted you to not see it as a deus ex machina, but to see it as an image capturing a truth. So this soldier dies. Well, it's a near-death experience, and he goes to the underworld, and he sees all kinds of lives there, right? All kinds of people who lived all kinds of ways, and they're attached to what they loved in the way they lived their life on earth. So if anyone's read Dante's Inferno or Purgatorio, you see this same concept, right? That in the afterlife, your soul, your character has been kind of conditioned by the choices you made over and over again. And you, in some ways, have your fate sealed. So you seem to have lachesis, which is chance, giving you a choice of all of these lives. That this is what's happening. What is happening on the superficial level. So you draw a straw, and that's how you determine who gets to pick from the new life first. Um, and one thing I like about that is that it's showing you that in life, there's a combination of control that we have and also of chance that is just never going to be under our control. So the lesson, I think, is virtue is without a master. He honors or dishonors her. Each will have more or less of her. The blame belongs to him who chooses. God is blameless. Keep that in mind as we keep going. So choice is made then in the context of necessity, and virtue is choosing well. You have these people who have chosen in different ways their whole life, and now they're choosing their next life. Well, can they choose well or can they not? The necessity portion is the order that they'll choose in, and the freedom portion is what they will choose. So what you see in the end is that the person who lived in the best regime was was able to choose first, but was not able to choose well. They choose a very poor kind of life because even though they had the best education, they did not internalize it. Okay. And they don't have the courage to hold to the right opinion in the underworld. And there's no hardiness or learning from experience on earth that helped them to choose well. Okay. And one thing that it looks like is the closer you are to tyranny, the more you are not able to judge rightly and to judge what is good. So in the end, the question is raised, is education enough? And are there going to be people who can get beyond a miseducation? Now, one of the final things that happens in the myth that's extremely important, especially when you think of the context of the myths of Greece and how he's reworking or trying to rework the stories that form their lives, is that Odysseus is in the underworld. And you remember he was very clever. He was more clever than he was just. And he was very famous and very spirited. But there are a lot of things he does that are not good choices, okay? But he's a hero, he's a model. And what is it that he chooses in the myth of Ur? He chooses the life of a private man. Why is this important for Plato's readers? Because it's a retelling of the former virtues. Okay, he's recasting what Odysseus, were he just, be like. Okay. According to the myth, then, who can be happy? How can a man or woman be happy on earth? It seems that the person who can be happy is the one who can have an ordered soul so that they can deal with the things that fate and contingency throw their way. Through philosophy, they can find a way to be happy, enjoying the good things, right? And keeping their eye on the truth during the bad. This is the most bliss, the most eros, the most justice, the most stability possible for the human on earth. And if you know what things are as they happen to you, you can enjoy pleasures in moderation, you can indulge spirit in moderation, and you can feast your reason. Some sort of joy does come from this, some sort of hope. So in the end, maybe the thing about human happiness, or the point is that it has to be able to grow. A part of happiness in life is joy, but part of satisfaction is maybe coping. the happiness that comes from the brave might be the final answer here. And this is part of why you can end up in this place where, going back to the beginning of the Republic, the man on the rack, or as the translation says, the man being crucified, can still be more content in their soul than the tyrant. And that's the Republic.